Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week, in the Americas, we look at the ongoing impact of Hurricane Erin on the United States East Coast and Bolivia's fractious presidential election. In Europe, Middle East and Africa, we cover escalating protests in Serbia, high-level peace summits on Ukraine, mass demonstrations in Israel, renewed violence in Syria's Swida region, and setbacks to the peace process in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We also look at a heightened terror threat in Kenya following a new U.S. embassy warning. And in Asia-Pacific, we assess the devastating floods across Pakistan, India, and Nepal that have left hundreds dead and displaced thousands. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Hurricane Erin continues to impact the United States East Coast. As of the 21st of August, the storm is located about 300 kilometers off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, with tropical storm conditions already impacting the Outer Banks. The National Hurricane Center has warned that these conditions are expected to worsen as high tide approaches. The hurricane's outer bands are brushing the coast, prompting the North Carolina Department of Transportation to close Highway 12 between Oregon Inlet and Hatteras Village due to storm surge. The National Hurricane Center has also issued warnings for tropical storm conditions along the Virginia coast and noted that similar conditions are possible in Bermuda on August 21st and 22nd. Meanwhile, dangerous rip currents continue to threaten many beaches along the U.S. East Coast. Earlier, Hurricane Erin caused power outages in Puerto Rico, leaving more than 45,000 residents without electricity in areas including Arecibo, Caguas, and San Juan. The storm's movement across the western Atlantic is expected to continue influencing weather conditions along the U.S. East Coast, with the potential for further strengthening. Now, for our assessment. Hurricane Erin is the first Atlantic hurricane of 2025. Forecasts indicate that the storm will skirt past the Caribbean islands and remain offshore along the U.S. East Coast as it moves north, gradually steering away from the shoreline. Even without a direct landfall, coastal areas will almost certainly feel the impact, with rip currents highly likely and waves expected to reach between 3 and 6 meters. In the Outer Banks, strong winds are also highly likely to accompany the dangerous tides and high waves. Hurricane conditions are forecast to persist through most of the week. The Atlantic hurricane season runs from the 1st of June to the 30th of November, typically peaking between mid-August and late September. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, there is a 60% chance of an above-average season in 2025, a 30% chance of a near-normal season, and a 10% chance of a below-average season. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration also predicts that there will likely be between 13 and 19 named storms and between 6 and 10 hurricanes. Staying in the Americas, Bolivia's presidential election is headed for a fractious runoff. On the 17th of August, Bolivians went to the polls to elect a new president. Preliminary results show centrist candidate Rodrigo Paz Pereira and right-wing former president Jorge Quiroga in the lead. With neither candidate securing a majority, a runoff election is scheduled for the 19th of October. This marks a potential end to more than 2 decades of left-wing rule, as the governing Movement for Socialism party won less than 4% of the vote. Notably, 19.4% of the ballots were declared void, far above the national average of around 5%. The Electoral Court is required to release the full official results by the 24th of August. Election day passed without major unrest, though a few incidents were reported. In Entre Rios, an explosive device was detonated near a polling station, where left-wing Popular Alliance candidate Andrónico Rodríguez was scheduled to cast his vote. Authorities confirmed there was no material or personal damage, and voting continued as normal. Now for our intelligence assessment. Before the election, there were widespread concerns about potential unrest, particularly among supporters of former President Evo Morales. His disqualification from running, seen by many as politically motivated, and the state's use of heavy-handed tactics against largely indigenous demonstrators have likely heightened tensions and alienated communities aligned with the former president. Morales had urged his followers to protest the vote and to cast null ballots, prompting government officials to warn of attempts to stir unrest. His cause almost certainly contributed to the unusually high percentage of void ballots. The collapse of the movement for socialism as a dominant force in Bolivian politics will almost certainly mark a major political realignment in the country. However, the erosion should not be interpreted as a loss of support for Evo Morales, particularly among his traditional base in rural and low-income areas. Despite being barred from the presidential race, Morales retains significant personal popularity, with some unofficial polls indicating he remains the most popular hypothetical candidate. His strongest backing continues to come from the Chapare region and from indigenous communities. Following the 19th October runoff, there is a high risk of sustained unrest, regardless of the outcome. Bolivia's political landscape remains deeply divided, not only between rival parties, but also within them. No candidate currently holds broad-based national support, and the election is unlikely to produce a clear or widely accepted mandate. Whatever party or coalition emerges victorious, it is likely to be seen as illegitimate by a significant portion of Bolivian society. This perception is highly likely to drive civil unrest, which in Bolivia often takes the form of roadblocks and violent confrontations with security forces. Now we turn to Europe, Middle East and Africa, where violent protests are escalating across Serbia. On the 14th of August, demonstrators targeted the offices of the ruling Serbian Progressive Party in Novi Sad, the city where a railway canopy collapse in November 2024 killed 16 people. Protesters reportedly smashed windows, threw furniture into the street, and splashed paint across the entrance. Riot police responded with tear gas and cordoned off several blocks in the city centre. Clashes also occurred in Belgrade, where hundreds of anti-government demonstrators confronted both police and party supporters. Riot police charged the protesters and again used tear gas to disperse the crowds. Additional protests were held in several other towns across the country. In downtown Valjevo, protesters wearing scarves and chanting anti-President Aleksandar Vučić slogans set fire to Serbian Progressive Party offices. They also caused significant damage at the court, prosecutor's office, and municipal building. Police responded with tear gas and charged the crowd, who threw bottles, rocks, and flares. One police officer was injured, and 18 protesters were arrested. Clashes also continued in Novi Sad and Belgrade, where demonstrators set multiple bins on fire. Police again deployed tear gas to disperse the crowds. In total, dozens of people have been injured and hundreds arrested. The unrest has spread into this week, with protesters vandalizing party offices in Belgrade's Kivihiceva neighborhood on August 18th and blocking the court entrance in Novi Sad on August 20th. President Aleksandar Vučić has responded to the demonstrations, declaring, "You will see the full determination of the Serbian state. We will use everything at our disposal to restore law, peace, and order." On August 15th, Russia's foreign ministry also issued a statement suggesting it might offer support to Vučić. The ministry described the unrest as violent riots and said that Russia cannot remain unresponsive to what is happening in brotherly Serbia. And now our assessment. The protests, which began in November 2024 after the railway canopy collapse in Novi Sad, have since evolved into broader anti-corruption and anti-government demonstrations. They have been fueled by widespread public dissatisfaction with the government and have drawn thousands of participants who continue to organize and mobilize across Serbia. While the demonstrations have been largely peaceful, they turned violent on August 13th when pro-government loyalists staged counter-demonstrations and clashed with protesters. The harsh response from security forces has further inflamed the demonstrations. An unverified video circulating on social media appears to show police officers beating a protester in Valjevo. civil rights groups have strongly criticized the authorities, with Michael O'Flaherty, the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights, condemning what he called the police's disproportionate force. He urged security forces to end arbitrary arrests and de-escalate the situation. The police response, reinforced by President Vucic's statements labeling demonstrators as terrorists, is highly likely to fuel further violent unrest as protesters press their demand for early parliamentary elections. Still in the region, where major summits in Alaska and Washington have marked an unprecedented push for peace in Ukraine. On August 15th, U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin met in Anchorage, Alaska. It was the first U.S.-Russia presidential meeting since the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. During the summit, Putin rejected Trump's call for an immediate ceasefire and instead demanded that Ukrainian forces withdraw from eastern Donetsk Oblast in exchange for a still undefined freezing of hostilities. In the hours before the Alaska summit, Russian forces launched aerial strikes against Ukraine, deploying 97 attack drones and decoys, along with 2 ballistic missiles. On the 18th of August, President Trump hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and a large delegation of European leaders at the White House for a multilateral summit. In contrast to the disastrous meeting between Zelensky and Trump in February, the atmosphere this time was notably cordial. European leaders pressed for a full ceasefire as a starting point for peace negotiations. However, President Trump downplayed the idea, suggesting that such a ceasefire was no longer feasible. All parties at the White House summit voiced support for direct negotiations between President Zelensky and Putin in the near future, with potential venues including Budapest or Istanbul. However, subsequent Kremlin messaging suggested this could only happen gradually, with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stating that it would have to be prepared with the expert level and thereafter going through all the required steps. Following the multilateral summit, Russian forces carried out the largest aerial attack against Ukraine so far in August 2025, launching 270 attack drones and decoys, along with 10 missiles. This came after mass aerial strikes the previous night, on August 17th. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. First, the ceasefire prerequisite for comprehensive peace negotiations has likely been de facto abandoned by President Trump following the Anchorage summit. Until last week, this was almost certainly the central demand of the Trump administration, Kyiv, and European allies. But without Washington's backing, it is highly unlikely that European powers will be able to pressure Moscow into agreeing to a ceasefire. The Kremlin is almost certainly disincentivized to accept one, given the growing pressure its forces are exerting on Ukrainian positions along the front lines of Donetsk Oblast. Second, Moscow's demand for a full Ukrainian withdrawal from Donetsk Oblast would likely pose an existential threat to Ukraine's sovereignty if carried out. Donetsk has seen the war's heaviest fighting, with Ukraine inflicting enormous casualties on Russian forces. Since Ukraine's spring 2022 counteroffensive, Russia has seized about 5.1 thousand square kilometers of territory and 5 fortified cities, defined as urban centers with pre-war populations of above 15,000. 8 fortified cities remain, including the large Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, along with about 6.5 thousand square kilometers of territory. This area is often referred to as the Fortress Belt. Most estimates suggest Russia would need years to capture it by force. If Ukraine ceded the Fortress Belt, it would be surrendering its most defensible line and exposing less fortified regions to potential future Russian advances. Without a ceasefire, withdrawing Ukrainian forces would also be highly vulnerable to Russian attack. Therefore, the only conditions under which Kyiv could plausibly agree to such a withdrawal would almost certainly be credible security guarantees, both against future Russian reinvasion and against attacks during the withdrawal itself. Third, discussions around long-term security guarantees for Kyiv are beginning to take a more concrete form. Current indications suggest that the United States and its European allies have floated the idea of Article 5-style guarantees, without offering actual NATO membership. According to U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Putin agreed to the suggestion in a game-changing concession. However, the Kremlin would likely seek to water down such guarantees with provisions, similar to past proposals that included requiring unanimous consensus or even bringing in China as a guarantor. Ukraine and its allies have also advocated for the deployment of a peacekeeping force. European allies appear prepared to contribute troops, although President Trump has ruled out any U.S. boots on the ground. The Kremlin, meanwhile, has flatly rejected any deployment of NATO member forces to Ukraine, describing this as a red line. It is highly unlikely that Moscow could accept NATO member peacekeepers, given its repeatedly stated aim of addressing what it calls the root causes of the conflict, a reference, often reiterated in recent days, to NATO expansion along Russia's borders. Given these factors, it is unlikely that the current diplomatic efforts will deliver peace in the short term. At the heart of the impasse lies a fundamental contradiction. Kyiv's insistence on sovereignty, which requires credible security guarantees against Russian aggression, and Moscow's maximalist objective of addressing what it calls the root causes of the conflict. The Kremlin will almost certainly continue trying to deflect U.S. pressure, having already sidestepped President Trump's ultimatum and ceasefire demands through its current level of engagement. That said, there is a realistic possibility that Moscow will eventually be compelled into direct talks between Putin and Zelensky, despite its ongoing efforts to equivocate. Meanwhile, as negotiations continue, Russian forces are highly likely to maintain maximum military pressure, both along the front lines and through aerial strikes. Now moving on to the Middle East, where Israel is facing mass protests as Hamas signals agreement to a ceasefire proposal. On August 17th, large-scale anti-government demonstrations and a general strike took place across the country, demanding a ceasefire and the release of hostages in Gaza. Hundreds of thousands joined rallies in Tel Aviv, where protesters blocked major highways and roads, including the Ayalon freeway, in some cases setting up burning tire barricades. Many businesses and universities also closed in solidarity. The largest rally was held in Hostages Square in Tel Aviv. Security forces used water cannon to disperse crowds and made dozens of arrests, with the most violent clashes occurring outside the ruling Likud party headquarters. Earlier, on the 14th of August, hundreds of ultra-Orthodox Haredim supporting the hardline Jerusalem faction and other groups staged protests outside the Beit Lid military prison. The demonstrations opposed Israel's expansion of the draft to include Haredi communities. Several Haredi students who had been detained for draft evasion the previous week were being held at the facility. Concurrently, on August 18th, Hamas announced that it had agreed to the terms of a ceasefire proposal mediated by Egypt and Qatar. The plan calls for an initial 60-day truce in Gaza. During this period, Hamas would release 10 living Israeli hostages in exchange for roughly 150 Palestinian prisoners, along with the exchange of bodies. The deal also includes a partial withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the entry of large-scale humanitarian aid into the territory. As of August 21st, the Netanyahu government has not accepted the ceasefire offer. An anonymous senior official stated that Israel's position remains unchanged, that all conditions, including the release of all hostages, must be met in order to end the war. On August 20th, around 60,000 IDF reservists were called up to support the proposed Gaza City takeover operation, though they are not expected to report for duty until September. Now, our assessment. The organizers of the large-scale unrest included the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, several university student groups, and opposition parties. Their goal was to pressure the Netanyahu government into agreeing to a ceasefire in Gaza. While the release of all hostages is one of Israel's primary stated war objectives, it is likely that Netanyahu's perceived prioritization of prosecuting a war of total defeat against Hamas would almost certainly endanger hostage lives. The protests were likely the largest in Israel since the Gaza war began in October 2023. Higher-end estimates put attendance at around 500,000 in Tel Aviv and up to 1 million nationwide. Organizers have announced a new round of demonstrations for August 24th, which will likely involve greater levels of direct action and disruption. Although the ceasefire proposal accepted by Hamas does not cover the release of all hostages, it is likely that significant elements of the Israeli opposition protest movement will be further motivated to take to the streets, applying pressure on the government to accept the deal. According to social media posts by Jerusalem faction supporters seen by Israeli police, Haredi protesters have allegedly planned a massive protest aimed at shutting down Ben Gurion International Airport. The action is intended as a response to the continued detention of Haredim accused of draft evasion. If carried out successfully, such a protest could cause significant disruption to air travel and result in economic damage. Previous protest movements in Israel have also targeted the country's primary international airport. The first preliminary stages of the proposed Gaza City takeover operation are almost certainly underway. There is a realistic possibility that Netanyahu's war cabinet is using these initial steps as strategic messaging intended to pressure Hamas into agreeing to further conditions beyond the current proposal. However, it remains likely that the Israeli government does plan to proceed with the highly controversial Gaza City operation. This is because its almost certain primary objective is the total defeat of Hamas. If the operation goes ahead, the humanitarian impact would almost certainly be severe and trigger civil unrest worldwide. Israeli domestic unrest is also likely to escalate further, with protesters increasingly turning to direct action, such as blocking routes to Ben Gurion International Airport. We now move on to Syria, where the Sweida ceasefire is faltering amid renewed violence and large Druze protests. Multiple ceasefire violations have been reported in southern Sweida province. According to local media, since August 15th, Syrian transitional government forces reportedly used heavy weapons near the villages of Al-Majdal, Al-Mazra'a, Najran, and Walga. Separately, gunfire from unspecified actors allegedly broke out in the villages of Dama, Jadal, Al-Shaya, and Arika. In one incident, 2 civilian vehicles were fired upon while traveling along the Busra al-Sham, Al-Kahil Road, a key humanitarian evacuation route from Sweida to Damascus. 1 civilian was killed. Furthermore, on August 16th, protests took place in Sweida city and surrounding towns. Hundreds of Druze demonstrators gathered in the largest rallies since heavy fighting erupted in July. In a notable development, many protesters called for self-determination, and some protesters were observed waving Israeli flags. Now for our intelligence assessment. The sectarian conflict in July between Druze militias and Sunni Bedouin tribal fighters left more than 1,600 people dead. The intervention by Syrian transitional government forces was almost certainly characterized by the state de facto siding with the Bedouins against the Druze. Multiple reports indicated that STG-affiliated unites carried out attacks against Druze civilians. This behavior almost certainly reflects the limited command and control Damascus exerts over much of its forces, which are largely made up of disparate militant formations with highly variable levels of integration into the new Syrian armed forces. Moreover, the intervention by the Israel Defense Forces, stated to be in support of the Druze, marked a significant regional escalation, with Israeli forces carrying out strikes on the Syrian Ministry of Defense headquarters in Damascus. It is likely that the current protests and ongoing ceasefire violations will be used by Israeli officials to justify any further strikes against Syrian transitional government forces. In addition to pressure from Israeli Druze, the Netanyahu government is likely incentivized to continue periodic strikes against Syrian government forces. This stems from Israel's broader effort to fragment and destabilize post-Assad Syria and to prevent the rise of what it likely views as a future adversary. This assessment also fits within Israel's widely observed post-October 2023 regional strategy of confronting all of its adversaries with military force. The US-brokered ceasefire in Sweden, signed on July 19th, has almost certainly been fragile from the start, but it is now highly likely in its most vulnerable state. The reported ambush of a civilian vehicle on the highway out of Sweden demonstrates that evacuation efforts are almost certainly being compromised by the ongoing violence. Clashes are highly likely to continue in the coming weeks, given the near certain lack of effective enforcement mechanisms. Furthermore, escalation is likely as separatist demands are emerging from sections of the Druze community. These demands directly challenge the transitional government of Ahmed al-Sharaa, which seeks to build a centralized and unified Syrian state rather than a decentralized federal system. Moving to Africa, where the peace process in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is at risk after AFCM-23 withdrew from negotiations. On August 18th, the Rwanda-backed AFCM-23 rebel group pulled out of scheduled peace talks with the Congolese government, claiming that the government doesn't want peace. AFCM-23 spokesperson Lawrence Kanyuka stated that the group would not return to the table unless the authorities adhered to the preliminary ceasefire agreement signed on July 19th. That deal required both sides to refrain from hate propaganda and from any attempt to seize by force new positions. The final peace agreement had been due for signing on the 18th of August, but mutual accusations of ceasefire violations in the past week have significantly strained relations. Now for our assessment. While accusations of ceasefire violations were the stated trigger for AFCM-23 withdrawal from peace talks, the agreement was highly likely to face deeper challenges. The Congolese government has insisted that any deal must include a full withdrawal of AFCM-23 from the territories it occupies, and it has shown little willingness to offer concessions. At the same time, given the inability of the Congolese armed forces to dislodge the group from its captured areas in North and South Kivu, AFCM-23 has incentive to comply with such demands. Even if the peace agreement had been signed, its implementation would have been highly likely undermined by the presence of the pro-government but hard-to-control Wazalendo militias. These militias would have been highly likely to ignore the deal and continue their offensives against AFCM-23. Such actions would almost certainly have prompted the rebel group to accuse the government of violating the agreement. It is also unlikely that Rwanda would have withdrawn its forces from Kivu. With regional rivals Uganda and Burundi active in eastern DRC, as well as the presence of Hutu militias such as the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, Rwanda almost certainly views maintaining its presence in the DRC as vital to its national security. A proposed three-phase peace plan by Qatar aimed at restoring government control over areas held by AFCM-23 is reportedly seen as unsatisfactory by Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi. While the proposal is set to be discussed under Qatar's mediation, a full collapse of the peace process remains likely. There is a realistic possibility that recent AFCM-23 advances were an attempt to gain more leverage ahead of the planned August 18th signing. However, the group's withdrawal suggests it was not serious about accepting any deal that required meaningful concessions. Given the weakness of the Congolese armed forces against AFCM-23 and the likelihood that the more effective Wazalendo militias would not comply with a peace agreement, the rebels have little incentive to sign. US President Donald Trump, who recently mediated a peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda, will likely attempt to increase pressure on both sides to compromise. Until then, renewed AFCM-23 offensives to capture more territory in North and South Kivu are likely. Also in Africa, Kenya faces a heightened terror threat after a new warning from the US Embassy. On August 19th, the embassy in Nairobi issued a security alert urging travelers to exercise personal security and situational awareness, particularly in high-traffic areas frequented by foreigners and tourists. These include hotels, embassies, restaurants, malls, markets, schools, police stations, and places of worship. The alert also noted a heightened risk around anniversaries of previous attacks, listing August 7th, September 11th, September 21st, and October 7th as key dates. And now our assessment. It is likely that credible intelligence indicates terrorist groups, highly likely Al-Shabaab, are planning an attack in Kenya. Al-Shabaab has carried out several deadly attacks in the country, including a 2013 siege of Nairobi's Westgate Mall, which killed 67 people, and the 2019 assault on the Dusit D2 hotel complex, which killed 21. The group's activity in Kenya is largely driven by reprisal attacks for Kenyan military involvement in Somalia, where 1,410 soldiers are deployed under the African Union Support and Stabilization Mission in Somalia. On June 17, 2025, a 22-year-old man was arrested with extensive bomb-making materials and handed over to Kenya's anti-terrorism police unit. This individual was highly likely linked to Al-Shabaab, underscoring the elevated threat level in the country. Alternatively, while Islamic State Somalia has never carried out an attack in Kenya, the group has recently suffered significant defeats in Somalia's Puntland region, many of them with US backing. Despite these setbacks, ISS almost certainly retains strong ties to the Islamic State Iraq and Syria, enabling it to improve its capabilities and secure funding. While unlikely, ISS may attempt a reprisal attack in Kenya to raise its profile and demonstrate operational reach beyond Somalia. Finally, we move to Asia-Pacific, where devastating floods across Pakistan, India, and Nepal have killed hundreds and displaced thousands. In northwest Pakistan, heavy rains and flash floods have killed at least 365 people and injured another 180. Rescue operations are ongoing. Most of the deaths were caused by flash flooding, though some resulted from house collapses, lightning strikes, and landslides. In India, the death toll has reached at least 70, while Nepal has reported 41 fatalities. This brings the combined regional death toll to at least 476. In Pakistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province has been most severely affected, particularly the district of Buna, but also Swat, Bajor, Battagram, Mansehra, Shangla, Lower Dir, and Abbottabad. Flooding has also impacted Sindh, Punjab, Balochistan, and Azad Kashmir. Parts of India and Nepal have also been hit hard by heavy rains and flooding. In India, the worst affected areas include Jammu and Kashmir, Uttarakhand, Telangana, Maharashtra, Mumbai, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka. In Mumbai alone, at least 21 people have died, and large parts of the city remain underwater. Heavy rainfall is expected to continue through August 21st, with further flash flooding likely in northern Punjab and Azad Kashmir. Rescue operations remain ongoing as authorities work to locate missing persons and deliver relief to affected communities. Power restoration is underway, with about 70% of Pakistan's electricity supply already back online. Major highways are also being drained and reopened. Authorities have warned that further storms are likely over the course of this monsoon season. Now for our intelligence assessment. South Asia is currently in the midst of its monsoon season, which typically runs from June to September and peaks in July and August. During this period, the region receives nearly 3/4 of its annual rainfall. Since the start of the 2025 season, severe flooding and landslides have killed at least 600 people and injured more than 700. The recent flooding has been largely triggered by cloudbursts, intense downpours where extreme rainfall falls over a small area in a short period of time. The resulting floods have caused widespread destruction, and authorities warn it will take weeks to clear streets and begin repair work. Further flooding is highly likely in the coming days, with forecasts predicting heavy rainfall through August 21st in northwest Pakistan. This will almost certainly worsen damage and casualty figures, while further hampering disaster response operations. Some residents in northwest Pakistan have criticized the government for not providing enough support. In Buna, the district most severely impacted, accusations have emerged that the government failed to issue an evacuation warning. Many residents reportedly fled their homes at the last moment and were unable to reach safe locations. The government has responded by claiming that the sudden downpour in Buna was so intense that it struck before the alert could be issued. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is a stronghold for opposition figure Imran Khan. Civil unrest will likely develop in the affected regions and major cities over the coming weeks in response to any perceived failures by authorities. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.